Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. We're just waiting for the numbers to rise. So here we go. Let's see who we got with us today. There's a magic number that we need to get to, and as soon as we get to that number, we will get going again. Okay, people are coming in, which is great. Just going to give it a couple more seconds just for people to register. We've just had a minor technical issue in that Zainab's microphone has just decided to stop working 2 minutes before we went live with the webinar. I think it's still not working, but
I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm back. Lovely.
Fantastic. It's like nothing ever happened and there was no moment of concern whatsoever. That's really good news. Okay, we're just going to give it 10 more seconds before we begin. Looks like the numbers are stabilizing, which is great. Okay, and yeah, here we go. All right, first of all, a huge welcome from all of us at Jones Chase to you and the attendees of the webinars. We are, of course, specialist employment lawyers, and we act for a number of companies from PLCs all the way through to startups. And we also act for some fantastic individuals as well. And above all else, we have a very high success rate of looking after those that we represent, which is north of 95%. And once again, we're delighted to have you with us. We have loads of content to go through. And for those of you that are new to the webinars, we'll just do a quick run round of the speakers. My name is Dean, I'm the firm's managing partner. We've also got Harriet, who's one of the firm's senior associates.
Hi, everyone.
And we've got Zane, one of the firm's associates, or qualified solicitors.
Hi, everyone. And now I have sound again, which is great.
Always better to hear you. And we've also got Katie, who's a trainee solicitor for 4 more days before qualifying.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone.
And that's the last time she'll smile in her legal career. There we go. Just kidding. Just moving quickly on. In terms of the format for the webinar, we're going to run through some important legal updates. And if you want to ask us questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A box. If you want to do this anonymously, which is important, hit the anonymous button. Otherwise, you can use the chat box as well. We'll be keeping an eye on both. Just to let you know, we will be recording the webinar because we want to distribute this to those of our client base that couldn't make it at 4 o'clock today. So just bear that in mind. If you're participating in the webinar, you can do it anonymously via the Q&A box, like I said, by ticking that box. If you want to speak to us live on the webinar, just mention the Q&A box or chat function that you'd like to be unmuted, and then one of us will unmute you so you can speak to us live. I should emphasize that the points that we're covering today are not formal legal advice, and of course, so much depends on the individual facts of the case. And sometimes the approach that you take in one case isn't what you do in another. So if you're unclear about anything, definitely pick up the phone to us or drop us an email just to check things, and don't rely on this webinar as formal legal advice or content in that regard, okay? As a quick reminder, the information that we're covering today is accurate as of 4 o'clock on the 27th of May. Things are changing exceptionally quickly as ever in the world of employment law, so do drop us a line if you have any questions. And we do appreciate that everyone's time is precious, so we will be finishing at 5 o'clock today on the dot, if not before. And finally, from us, we do helping people, so if there's any other businesses out that could benefit from good employment lawyers or any individuals, which is 50% of our practice, feel free to pass our details on. We'd be delighted to have a chat with them, and if possible, to help them with whatever they're dealing with as well. Okay, so moving very quickly on with the content, I'm just going to hand over to Harriet. Well, both of us are going to cover this topic actually. But Harriet's going to be speaking to you about the new ACAS report. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. We've got some slides which we're going to be looking at as well. If Dean's able to do a little screen share, I'll just...
And whilst you're getting ready, there's one thing I was going to say. Because the focus of this webinar is about conflict resolution, we would very much like to hear from you during the webinar if you have any particular preferred conflict resolution methods that you've employed within your organization that have been successful. So feel free to keep using the Q&A box primarily to communicate with us. Some of the figures in the report Harriet is going to go through are quite enlightening, to say the least. So by all means, share your thoughts with us, share some stories, and where possible, we'll get you engaged in the webinar as well, and we'll read out your responses. Okay, so let's make it interactive, and over to you, Harriet.
Lovely, thanks, Dean. So you may be aware of the new report published by ACAS, which is called Estimating the Cost of Workplace Conflict. It was published just on the 11th of May, and you can find it and obviously read through it yourself at your leisure at acas.org.uk. It was prepared for ACAS by 2 academics, so it's much more detailed than the information we usually get from ACAS. And note that this isn't ACAS guidance in itself. But we wanted to share with you today some of the key findings of the report, particularly the breakdown of which scenarios are most costly to the business in terms of conflict. And in this way, we can consider where organisations may want to focus their investment at an earlier or later stage of where conflict may arise, and also to have a look at the way in which organisations can seek to reduce the amount and the cost of conflict. So one of the sort of headline points of the report is that it estimates that workplace conflict costs UK employers £28.5 billion every year. And that works out at an average of just over £1,000 for every employee. And this estimate is based on the total cost to organisations in handling workplace conflict, which includes informal, formal and legal processes, as well as the cost of sickness absence and resignations. It looks at the total array of issues there. And the report shows that nearly 500,000 employees resign each year as a result of conflict, and that handling disagreements and complaints early before the employment relationships are damaged can help save businesses money. And importantly, poor conflict management can also cause staff stress and anxiety or depression, which in itself obviously impacts workplace productivity. And we'll see one of the issues is that if people don't even raise their issue in the workplace, this can also be very costly by way of resignations. The findings relate to just before the pandemic, but interestingly, the report shows that there's a potential for increased conflict now as organisations inevitably seek to adapt to new changes coming out of the pandemic, and things which may have been suppressed during the past 14 months of people working at home and just trying to cope with life generally may start to rise up as people return to the workplace or have hybrid working arrangements. A lot of organisations having continuing change and economic pressures. So I think now it's more important than ever for managers to have the skills that are needed to try and prevent and manage and resolve this conflict. So looking at the report now, so I don't know, Dean, if you could move on a couple of slides to the first, yeah, that one please. So just to look at some percentages which I think are quite interesting in terms of the impact of conflict on employees. The vast majority of employees did stay with the organisation, which is obviously good news, and only 5% actually resigned. A slightly higher proportion at 9%, as you can see, took time off as sickness absence. But I think what's really interesting is that 40% reported being less motivated, and more than half reported stress, anxiety and or depression. So there's a lot of organisations there with a lot of employees who probably have decreased productivity, even if they are still with the business, and they may not even have raised the issue that's causing the lack of productivity. Just on the next slide, please, Dean.
Sure.
And I've mentioned the cost of discipline and grievance in terms of management time, because it's something that we spend a fair bit of time dealing with. And the average cost in management time, as you'll see, is estimated at £951 per employee, a total across the economy of 356 million. Disciplinary is a little higher, with just over £1,000 per employee at a total cost of 2 billion. So you can see that there's sort of huge costs involved here. But interestingly, replacing dismissed employees is just over 13 billion. So really what we can see, and I'll show you some more figures in a second, is that the largest proportion of the costs of conflict are connected to the end of the employment relationship. So either where employees resign or are dismissed. And in the early stages, the costs are relatively low, so things can be managed. But obviously once you get to formal processes and the employee leaving, the costs do get a lot higher. And I'll look at different scenarios in a minute to see that. If we have the next slide, please, Dean.
Sure.
So I hope that you can, sorry, it's a bit tiny, but hopefully you'll be able to see enough of the figures to see the contrast in the different costs with the different sort of phases of workplace conflict. And it shows the total annual cost across the economy broken down. And you can see clearly from that, the first section, resignations, sickness absence and presenteeism, has got the biggest associated cost, followed by formal procedures. And I think interestingly, litigation is actually a very small cost compared with the two I've just mentioned, and probably because the incidence of litigation is much lower than the incidence of discipline and grievance, etc. And informal processes are much the lowest cost. And I just wanted to look at a couple of these in a little bit more detail. Firstly, resignations. You can see hopefully here that the total cost of resignations is 11.9 billion across the economy. And this is the single biggest annual cost of all the various costs listed in the table. And it's measured using two aspects. So firstly, the average cost of recruitment and replacement costs like induction training. The report estimates this at just under £5,500 per employee. And the main cost is in lost productivity as new employees get up to speed, which is estimated just over £25,000 per employee, which Dean and I thought was a huge figure. So you've got a cost of just over £30,000 per employee each time somebody leaves, and an awful lot of people are leaving because of issues perhaps they haven't even raised in the workplace. Obviously, some amount of turnover is inevitable even without workplace conflict, but I still find these figures are quite surprising. Just on sickness absence, the report acknowledges that's a little bit more difficult to measure. It's still a pretty high cost compared with some of the other costs of conflict. And the report estimates that those employees who experience workplace conflict take an average of an extra 17 days sickness absence over and above the average without conflict, which is 4.4 days. So there's a big difference there between people who experience conflict are taking time off sick. And I think we probably all see this. We see many cases where employees are off sick, where there's some form of conflict at work, and I'm sure that you do too. But that equates to 15 million days per year being lost through sickness absence as a result of conflict, which again I thought was pretty interesting. Moving on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to look at the costs to an individual organisation of 4 different scenarios, and these are tables taken from the report, which I thought illustrate the issues really clearly. So we've got the first slide here is where conflict is unseen and not raised, and you can see it causes an impact on motivation and productivity, and then the employee ends up leaving. So this is where there hasn't even been, the issue hasn't been raised and there hasn't been a resolution sought, and that in itself is costing the organisation just over £31,000. Next slide, please, Dean. So the second scenario is where there is early informal resolution, so probably the sort of best case scenario. The issue is raised and it's dealt with effectively, and here it says they've used workplace mediation, and the individual stays, and that's just under £2,000. So that's obviously the best kind of scenario. The next slide, please, Dean. This is where an issue is. It's probably quite a typical scenario, actually. Well, perhaps apart from the end bit, but the issue's raised. The line manager doesn't handle it very well, so the individual ends up bringing a grievance. They then take time off due to stress and anxiety, but in this case, it's ultimately resolved using formal procedures without the employee leaving. So you can see that actually, even when things don't go very well, actually, if the organisation has good procedures and uses them, you limit that cost. And then the final slide, please, Dean, is the same as the previous scenario. However, rather than it being resolved, the employee resigns and claims constructive dismissal. And there you can see that the costs just skyrocket once that individual leaves and ends up in a tribunal claim. But the actual tribunal claim that was interesting in the report, obviously this is a much less common scenario. And according to a CIPD survey, only 1.4% of conflicts involve an employment tribunal claim being filed, which obviously is good news. There's a very small proportion of issues do actually end up in an employment tribunal. And data from 2011 shows that just 4 out of every 100 employers are subject to employment tribunal claims. So again, it shows that it's quite a low risk, really, and that's why it's interesting that I find that perceptions of the risk of litigation have been quite a major factor in how dispute resolution policy is actually formed. But actually, that's quite a low risk to the organisation. And the report shows that the cost of litigation is actually only a quarter of the cost of absence as a result of conflict. It's significantly less than the cost of reduced productivity, and it's only a fraction of the cost of staff exits through resignation. So I'm going to hand over to Dean now to look at the implications of all this for organisations, and to look at some tips as to how to both reduce conflict and therefore the associated costs.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Harry. And I think from my perspective as well, it's just worth emphasising, whilst initially I thought what the report would say is common sense, workplace conflicts are expensive, I was genuinely shocked by some of the figures within there. The 28.5 billion is such a considerable cost, so this is something that we need to pay attention to. I was also surprised that litigation, which is typically envisaged to be the most expensive part of all of this, that's the thing that everybody fears, forms a much smaller percentage of the overall cost, as Harriet has just said. And just finally, I was genuinely surprised about just the cost of a simple resignation. That was one of the highest costs that they found in doing the surveys, which the report suggests is £31,103 per employee. And as Harriet's already said, the estimated cost of getting new employees up to speed within an organisation costs UK businesses £14.9 billion per year. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it's genuinely changed the way I've looked at things as well. I had no idea that a resignation, which from an employment law perspective is often deemed to be a low risk event. As lawyers, we think, oh, that person's resigned, great. Unless it's a constructive dismissal, then there's no claims, etc. So then if you can tick that box, that's done. But yeah, just had no idea how much what the true cost of the organization is. And there's a few things, many things we can get from this report, but the primary message, other than the cost, is that if things are dealt with quickly, then the cost of dealing with them is significantly reduced. And again, that sounds like common sense, but it genuinely is often overlooked in practice. And I think all too often lawyers and HR professionals, they can stick to the formal processes too much. And what the report makes quite clear is that the moment something becomes formal, employees' stress levels typically go through the roof. It is more expensive to deal with, and it just costs a lot more money for the company. So what we've come up with is, well, I should say, Jones Chase's top 10 tips to minimize the cost of conflict within your organization. Okay, no slides with this, unfortunately, but if you want me to send an email summarizing my thoughts, I'm more than happy to send that to you after the webinar. Just drop me a line at dean.jones@joneschase.com. I'll be happy to send this to you. Okay, and number one of the top 10 tips to minimize the cost of conflict is early resolution is absolutely critical in this regard. And in my view, and what me and Harry wanted to do today was we didn't want to just regurgitate things from the report. We wanted to give you some pointers outside of the report as well. And just thinking about things, early resolution typically involves two things. Number one, it involves your staff members feeling comfortable enough to raise the issue and to actually raise it within the organization one way or the other. Sometimes in some places that only happens when people are literally at breaking point, which can be a bit too late. Early resolution involves, number one, getting your staff members to raise it and to make sure they're comfortable enough to do it. And then secondly, your colleagues, managers and HR team members, they need to have the core people skills and training to have productive and meaningful interventions at this stage. It's an absolute golden opportunity to save tens of thousands of pounds if things can be resolved at the early stage. Okay, so how do we encourage people to speak up? Firstly, I think as we all know, a lot of this is to do with the culture of the organisation, and this does come from the top down, from board level down. And what you could do, if you're sitting on the board, then you can organise this. If you're not on the board, you can encourage them. What you can encourage the board to meet about this is to get a meeting together at the top of the organisation to discuss how to deal with conflict within the business, and to look at your past records and trends and look at exits from the business as well. And for example, you could put in place a speaking up policy, which is an informal policy. It's not a formal grievance policy or a whistleblowing policy. We're still just to encourage your staff members, to give them the confidence that they can raise things informally and to get them to raise things early, which again, as the report demonstrates, can produce some significant cost savings. And in fact, having people raise things informally, what the ACAS report suggests is that it does work. So 55% of those people who discussed the issue with their colleague felt that it was resolved. If people don't feel comfortable raising it with a colleague, which is what the ACAS actually recommend, then of course they should feel able to raise it with management or HR. And in that regard, you could have a second policy, for example. You could have an open door policy, which again encourages staff to raise the issue with managers with no repercussions and to have a very honest conversation about it. And it's quite clear from the report that the costs where issues weren't raised internally were comparatively higher, and quite often it would lead to people resigning. They didn't feel comfortable raising it internally. And as we all know, the cost of resignation on average per person is £30,000. It's actually more for a more senior member of staff, depending on salary. As a firm, Jones Chase, of course, we can help you with the preparation of these internal policies. So if you need any help in that regard, I just want to talk this through generally, definitely drop us a line. So point number two, on top of early resolution, we think is staff training. So it's a really good idea to train your managers in not only how to deal with issues or conflicts that are raised, but also in how to spot them as well. Particularly important due to the coming back to work after the pandemic, which Katie's going to speak to you about. So it's really important for managers not to bury their head in the sand or to ignore an issue that's brewing under the surface because they're too busy dealing with other matters. So where things are raised, again, it's a golden opportunity to take action and to pull that into an informal process to really try to get on top of things, okay? So yeah, staff training for managers, super important. And on that point as well, slightly different take on it is to train managers on how to be effective and firm managers without crossing the line, because quite often 50% of our business is claimant work. So we typically get a lot of cases from people who feel they've been bullied by their manager because it's the manager's job to drive performance within the organization, but of course they feel they're doing it in a way that's bullying, oppressive, is causing a lot of stress. So training managers on how to be good managers without being bullies is super important as well. Number 3, already mentioned it, but promoting informal resolution is absolutely huge, and you should definitely include this within your formal policy. So you should have an opening section that really tries to drive people towards informal resolution rather than formal. So this should be in your grievance policy, your disciplinary policy, your bullying and harassment policy, and also your capability of performance management policy as well. And I think this approach, it represents a current trend of a move away from strict legal compliance. And quite often policies are written with the tribunal in mind, or a very legalistic approach. We think a more modern approach can now be taken as well to encourage that it looks less scary, less draconian, even if it's a disciplinary procedure. So again, if any of these companies or anybody needs any help updating, modernizing their policies, grievance and disciplinary, happy to do so. Definitely drop us a line in that regard. Okay, point number 4 is I've named as act quickly and decisively. I think, as the report recognises, some workplace conflict is inevitable, and conflict usually starts with a difference in opinion. And inherently, there's a lot of people out there doing a job that they're getting paid to do something that they typically don't want to do, and the employer typically wants them to do more per day, and the employee wants to do less. The employment relationship is ripe for conflict, of course, and some of it is inevitable. And where this happens, I think it's important for companies to act quickly and decisively. Like I've said, sometimes the wrong person is in the wrong job, and it can cost the employer literally thousands if it's not managed correctly. It can also lead to other team members being upset if somebody isn't doing their job properly. It can cause massive disharmony. And provided there's no whistleblowing or discrimination issues, if somebody has less than 2 years service, they can't bring an unfair dismissal claim unless there's any other reason for an automatic unfair dismissal. So acting decisively and quickly in this regard can be a good thing. I think usually your gut instinct is right. If you've got a feeling that somebody just isn't up to the job, then maybe it's time for them to leave the business. If you genuinely think that trying to manage their performance or helping them just won't do it. So you've got up to 2 years to dismiss without an unfair dismissal claim being brought. It's a very long probationary period in looking at it in many respects. Point number 5, really important to analyse patterns within your organisation. Often this isn't done. Are there some managers in particular with a really high turnover of staff? We now know what the true cost of a resignation could be, north of £30,000 on average. So just have a look around the organisation. Is there a team with a really high turnover? Because it's indirectly costing you literally thousands. And then you can take remedial action. You can speak to the manager, get training, interview the staff, do a staff survey, find out what's happening within that team in particular. Something that comes up for us as employment lawyers quite a lot is what I call the new manager scenario. And that's where you've got somebody who's performed very well and very happy within an organisation. They get a new manager, and everything just goes completely belly up, and they become very stressed. They look at leaving the organisation, and it's worth just looking to see where a new manager is being hired or appointed or moved around the organisation, how the staff are doing in that regard. How it's mentioned the cost of people just putting up with things and becoming very stressed, and presenteeism within the organisation. So definitely look at where managers are moving and just make sure the integration is gone. We tend to find that's one of the biggest causes for people instructing employment lawyers as it happens. Moving quickly on, point number 6 is to have an open mind as to how things get resolved. As I've said, it's not all about formal processes, which of course do have their place, but do consider things like pushing people to resolve things informally or trying workplace mediation as well. It can be very effective, and more north of 50% people have tried workplace mediation were happy with the result of it, as I understand now. And so definitely don't have an over-reliance on formal processes. If you're working in HR and one of the company's managers comes to you saying, I'd like to performance manage this person out, or would like to run a formal process, do challenge that decision. If somebody wants to, again, challenge it delicately, find out whether that person really intends to go down the formal process. It can be stressful. Can things be resolved in an informal way? Something that we've used a lot for claimants, or I've used multiple times, is what I call the cards on the table discussion, which is where we've suggested to clients, as claimants who are typically being performanced or managed out of a business, is to have a cards on the table discussion with their manager, where they can just say to them, look, I know you're trying to get rid of me, for want of a better expression. I know this isn't working. Just tell me why isn't it working, exactly what's on your mind, what can I do better, and how can we make this work? And it can be quite disarming, and sometimes some of the cases that we've had, which began as a constructive dismissal or unfair dismissal scenario, they've had a cards on the table discussion with their manager, and it's really led to, you know, a complete turnaround of everything. And the manager was surprised, I didn't realize I could speak to you in this way or about this, and let's work out a plan. And then you can put targets in place and genuinely help someone to manage their performance rather than the exit way of doing it, which we all know about. Number 7, again, be creative with your solutions, think outside the box. If 2 people don't get on within the team, does one person have to work with the other one? Can you split them up? We've had one case where someone had a huge problem with one of their direct reports, and it suggested, do you have to manage that person? And the answer was no. So, okay, brilliant. So they've just moved this person around, different line manager, and problem solved. So again, just don't have a blinkered approach and just keep going down the legal or the formal processes. You know, what other creative solutions are there? For example, what about allowing flexible working, allowing one employee to work from home half the week, the other person to work in the office half the week, and then they swap over. So if they genuinely hate each other, which does happen sometimes, keeping them apart from each other can be a good thing. It will lead to less conflict, and just ultimately try to get into a position where people find their happiness in work, and then they'll be productive and happy, and you won't get these expensive disputes. Point number 8, it is definitely worth mentioning. Sorry, it's slightly self-serving in some ways, but it is worth taking legal advice early on in the process as well. If you're struggling to know what to do, or if you have a problem that you just can't resolve, or you think it's going to go formal, or you don't have time to deal with it, definitely give us a call, or whoever you instruct. As a firm, Jones Chase has got over 100 years of combined experience resolving workplace conflicts, and we do it very effectively with a high success rate. If you're being decisive and you want somebody out of the business, we can help you with a prompt without prejudice negotiation, or a section 111A sort of protected conversation as well. And we can prepare settlement agreements. So again, if things really aren't working out and you don't think they're going to, getting hold of us sooner rather than later will ultimately save tens of thousands of pounds, and we can get somebody out of the business and help to create harmony again. Just 2 more things very quickly. So just thinking outside the box slightly as well, it's point number 9, it's worth having a very thorough recruitment process. Competency test people before and they join the organization, get it right from the start. Too many companies that I've seen in my career as well, they just keep churning through people, and they hire and then fire. And if you get it right from the start, you won't need to do that. If you get a really good recruitment process, and again, if you need any help in that regard with policies, we can help you with this. Absolutely critical, and save you so much money at the end of the employment relationship when someone's leaving. And finally, Harriet's idea, I did say to her earlier to steal this as my own idea, but this is Harriet's idea specifically. Exit interviews, hugely important to get this done properly. This is where you can, because someone's leaving, as Harriet already said, it's the most expensive time for employers, whether it's a resignation or a dismissal. But do invest your time in exit interviews. Do them properly, really try to get the employee or the staff member to open up about exactly why they're leaving. And then if you can get them talking, they will disclose problems. Things could be done to fix things then. And once again, you'll have a considerable savings. Those are our top 10 tips for reducing the cost of conflict. And we're just going to move on. Unless there's any questions, I don't think anything's come in so far. Just check the chat box. No, we're good. Okay, so just hand over to Zainab, who's going to speak to you about an interesting report from the BBC. So over to you, Zainab.
Thanks, Dean and Harriet. So very excitingly, social distancing measures are hopefully coming to an end on the 21st of June. We've been waiting for so long for that. And the BBC have essentially carried out a survey. And I don't think the results of the survey would be particularly surprising to all of us, especially on the basis that we've been talking about a return to work and being home-based and work office-based as well. The fact that lots of companies are shifting in their kind of original ideas of staying in the office to now allowing part-time home working or some kind of flexible home working. So there was a survey carried out by the BBC, and in that survey, it found that 43 out of 50 of the big UK employers who have together over 1 million employees are not planning on bringing their employees back to the office full time. The companies are instead encouraging a mix of home working and office working, with staff coming into work maybe 2 or 3 times a week. So the survey was carried out following news from KPMG that their employees would only be coming back into the office for 2 days a week, and Google revealing plans for 20% of its staff to work from home permanently in the future, which is a significant number for them. Now, although lots of companies are shifting, thinking more about home working, we have sectors which are not. They firmly want people back in the office. That's not to say all the companies within those sectors do, but so investment bank Goldman Sachs, for example, has moved quite in the opposite direction, telling its US and UK bankers that everyone needs to prepare to come back into the office next month. I don't think that's particularly surprising, considering David Solomon, who's the chief exec for Goldman Sachs, described home working as an aberration, I think, at one point during the pandemic. So he wants everyone back at their terminals at Goldman Sachs. And so all of their workers will be returning from the 21st of June. So we're seeing differences within sectors. If you imagine, you have to imagine certain sectors require creativity, more creativity than others. So advertising and creative industries, they spend a lot of time round tables and discussing together, being creative, and that maybe isn't so workable with part of their staff being working from home. A lot of the companies in the survey are, for the survey the BBC did, are looking at, instead of having preset rules, encouraging their managers and leaders to engage with their colleagues, engage with the people that they manage, to implement strategies that work specifically for their business. The survey also found that only a few of the companies that the BBC had looked at will be shutting offices altogether. So Lloyds Bank has plans to close 20% of its offices over the next 3 years. Newspaper group Reach has closed all its district offices and is moving to a more hub-based model instead. And the survey also found that companies recognize that for a lot of people, they don't necessarily have a good or safe space to work from at home, and that in those cases, they'd rather have their employees in the office, and that's where their employees rather be. So just in terms of what you need to think about, considering 21st of June is fast approaching, and if you are planning on bringing people back into the office or not, first of all, plan carefully. It should already be in motion. As I said, June is next week. 21st of June isn't, but June is next week. And so you should already be figuring out where you want to go, what you want, how you want work life to look for your employees going forward. If you haven't already, you should be carrying out surveys to put plans into place. Although flexibility is great, you do want to have some level of certainty so employees know what's going on. There needs to be a clarity on how you deal with communication with respect to home and office working. Obviously, health and safety checks for the work environment. Bear in mind that some employees may not have been back in the office for 15 months now. Could be quite anxiety inducing to come back into the office again, to get back on a train. Some people may not have been on a train for that long as well, if they use public transport to get into the office. So they'll want to know that the company has done everything that it can to ensure that it's keeping them safe and their colleagues safe as well. If you don't have home working or hybrid home working policies in place and you plan to continue with elements of home working, we would strongly suggest that you get one of those policies in place. I think we discussed this in quite a lot of detail on our health and safety webinar, which we did in March 2021. And that's obviously something that we can assist with if you want those policies. You also, it may be worth putting systems into place so that employees, so you know where your employees are on particular days when they are coming into the office. So there isn't a bit of jostling for desks if you turned into hot desking, for example. And there are various systems that you can put into place which are available. And then the last thing is think about having socials. We haven't all been together in the workplace for a long time. So it would be a nice thing to be able to do for your employees, obviously in a safe way. And Katie, I believe, is going to be talking to us a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks very much. I think there's just disappeared there slightly.
An end. So I'm in end scene. No, I'm in an office. I'm in an office in the office. I'm sorry, the lights keep going up because I'm not moving. So I'm just going to go for it.
It's the most fortuitous timing I think I've ever seen it go on. Anyway, and I think the suggestion for a get together was availed, prompted me to organise one, obviously, which I did say we're going to do now when it was safe to do. That's important. And whilst Katie's doing her section as well, just on the issue of, all these huge companies not getting everyone back to the office, millions of people not doing so. Just very intrigued to hear from all of the attendees as to what their plans are. Jones Chase, we're adopting a hybrid approach, so we can have some time working in the office, some time working from home. I think that will work well for us. It's the most flexibility. It seems to be what people want from the staff survey we carried out. Just very keen to hear from all of you as to what your plans are come the 21st of June. So feel free to drop that in the Q&A box anonymously should you wish. Is everyone coming back full time? Are you getting rid of the office or workspace completely, or a hybrid approach, or are you working from the Bahamas or something? Just really keen to hear from you exactly what you're doing. And just on that point, so just going to move on to the final section that we've got today, which is Katie's section. And Katie's going to be speaking to us about a few things to be aware of about adjusting to the new normal and the impact this may have on behaviour and disciplinary issues. So over to you, Katie.
Hi everyone. So I got a slightly more negative tone to my piece this week. Zaid was touched on how exciting and nice it might be for your staff to have some work socials, but I wanted to put out a bit of a warning. I think on the tone of the webinar has been on conduct and a bit about misconduct. So I think we've seen a rise in cases over the last couple of months as offices are beginning to open up, and it's almost like the classic Christmas party cases have come around early. So we're seeing a rise in some sort of misconduct and some misbehaviour at work socials, and we think that this is something that might become increasingly an issue over the next couple of months as we start to open up and we start to socialise again, and we're starting to all have a bit more fun. So we think that there's lots of reasons why we might be seeing a steep rise in these types of issues. So we've got workers that have been isolated and restricted for long periods of time, some of those with not a huge amount of people, and people haven't been seeing their friends. So we think this could mean that people are a bit more likely to be letting loose, and they want to have a lot of fun. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, at your companies, I don't know, a bit gearing to go with some work socials. But on the flip side of this, we think there's probably quite a few people that are coming back after an isolated period feeling quite sensitive and not so ready to be thrown into the depths of workplace banter, for lack of a better word. We also think there might be a chance that people have not been drinking a lot over the past year, which might mean people's tolerances are a little bit bruised, and people might be getting a little bit more out of control. Oh, did you say yes before? I said out of control, or after?
Recording only, not being out of control, but my alcohol tolerance coming down. So I need to be on super best behaviour. Well, social that we have, obviously, and stick to normal water only, I think.
I think you're going to be one or very many, which is why I thought it might be a good time to point this out to everyone. And just to build on what Zainab was saying, I think with these flexible working arrangements, which we're going to be seeing a lot more of, and more people just wholesale working from home, I think if you're not seeing your colleagues every day, maybe the 2 days that you're in is the 2 days they're not in, when you do eventually meet up for a work social, who knows, but maybe there's a bit more of a chance that you just forget that they are your colleague and you're not at a big party, you're still at a workplace event. So our recommendation is that you HR and managers and seniors need to be doing something to remind employees of expected and acceptable standards of behaviour at work, and especially these workplace events. When I had a little look at case law and I was getting prepared for this, and there's heaps of it. Maybe you're all lucky if you haven't ever had any issues with workplace socials. But yeah, and also what I want to say is that just because it doesn't happen on office premises during working hours, issues arising at these events will probably become an issue for HR eventually, and it will become a workplace issue. So I'm not touching on whether employers would be vicariously liable for any misbehaviour or discriminatory conduct or aggressive behaviour at workplace events. That's a different area of law. That would be a whole webinar session in itself about when it becomes still the workplace or not. But whether or not it's considered in terms of vicarious liability as an extension of a workplace event, it's still an issue that can find itself back to HR if someone thinks they've been bullied at a team get together in the pub down the road. It's going to find its way back to you guys, and yeah, it will end up a disciplinary issue or a grievance or something that you won't be able to avoid. I think it's also important and the right time to remind your managers and senior managers that they are held to a higher level than other employees, and they need to be aware of this at workplace socials. So managers getting too involved in the drinking and office banter do leave themselves more vulnerable to complaints and sanctions. I think looking at case law and in our experience, people are more likely to complain about insulting behaviour of a more senior individual to them, and are possibly more likely to feel aggrieved if they felt insulted by a more senior member of staff. Just in terms of some practical tips that we've put together that you guys could put in place in the next couple of weeks, or if you're planning the work socials, we would recommend you build a good sensitive code of conduct, or even a conduct policy on social work events. So in itself, a very isolated and centred policy. So you could remind employees about standards of behaviour and company policies in relation to disciplinary and grievance, harassment, social media before the party start. You could even wrap this up in an email to everyone, a welcome back. I appreciate everyone's been in isolation, difficulties in coming back to work. Some of you might feel quite overwhelmed, and then you can slip in a bit about accepted standards, so it's not quite so patronising and we're all really worried you're all going to misbehave. And then particularly separate emails to managers, and even maybe a managers meeting, so you could carve it out that way, just to let managers know that there's a higher standard there. And then reminding managers and heads of departments they're expected to take the lead and intervene at an early stage if matters get out of hand, and perhaps even ease people into work socials. So think carefully about parties with unlimited alcohol. But like I said, it doesn't have to be a planned event for issues to come back to HR. It can just be one team of individuals going down to the pub after a day of work. And then a designated manager who can stay alcohol free, and they can keep an eye on the event and any unacceptable, potentially dangerous behaviour. And then, and I touched on it just now, but maybe attempt to put limits on the free flowing alcohol for a little while we're all easing ourselves back into the fun. But it's a slightly negative look at all the exciting opening up. I do think it's a conversation worth having and something to be thinking about. So that's everything from me.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kitty, because we had a discussion earlier this week about, whether companies should actually send an email to the staff or not. It's really difficult to get the tone of that, isn't it? But if we think about, and the conclusion we came to is that people should, albeit it needs to be worded appropriately. Because thinking about it as well, if this situation, the cases tend to be, you never know what's going to come in. And I think there's a number of things I wanted to add, or just to confirm with what you were saying as well. The problems that can come out of something going wrong at a workplace social event can be quite binary in terms of the employment relationship. If something happens, it's harassment. If the company's very pro-equality, as they should be, and they have a zero harassment and bullying policy. If it's an extension of the workplace, and as you've said, there's loads of case law to support that, these things can be, where the company is then presented with effectively a grievance or a complaint from somebody about sexual harassment or inappropriate jokes or harassment generally. What action are they going to take? It wasn't in the workplace, everyone was really drunk, it was out of the work, and as we know, the cost of someone leaving the business is hugely expensive. There's also an awareness issue as well, and as you've said, is that a lot of people genuinely don't realise that if they're in not the place that the event was organised, then they go on to a different pub, they seem to, ties come off and more drinks go down, and they seem to think they're outside of the work environment, but they may not be. And it's raising the awareness with everyone's colleagues here, and that there has to be, and as you say, particularly managers as well, because the costs of this going on are absolutely significant. So an email to staff members, if you need a hand with the wording, drop us a line, or even a workplace conduct at workplace social events policy. It doesn't need to be very long, can go out as well as reminding people what standards of behaviour apply. It should be the same in the workplace as out of the workplace, so these things as well. I think that's it for the topic. Any questions? We've had no questions in today, which is very interesting, and we always leave some time for questions, live questions during the webinar. Had a few comments as to how people are going to be working going forward. One from an anonymous attendee whose company is going to be adopting a hybrid home and office working policy. And Sharon's also said that they sent a survey out and it's being analysed, and they will most likely implement hybrid working and look at what the employee needs to do. As we said, with a number of legal issues you need to consider with that as well, just to get that right, particularly if it's happening on a long-term basis, not just an emergency basis. And lastly, Kathy's mentioned that most people are coming back to her organisation with possibly some hybrid working. That's it for the content today. Just a quick mention to Samantha, who's sent in a question in regarding holidays. We didn't have time to do that today, unfortunately, or to give it the justice that it needs. We are actually doing an opening up webinar on the 17th of June where we will address that question head on, and we'll actually speak in a lot more detail about the issue of taking holidays and the green countries, the amber countries, and whether people are working or self-isolating, and that whole sort of mess about the quarantine period as well. But we're going to cover that in a lot more detail to give the question the airtime that it deserves on the 17th of June in what I hope is our final opening up policy. Webinar even, so not policy, Freudian slip. Final opening up webinar hopefully on the 27th, also the 17th of June. But until then, I think that's it for today. We finished slightly early. So just a quick reminder, the information we've covered is accurate as of the 27th of May 2021. If you have any questions after this, or you'd like to be sent the sort of top 10 tips to reduce the cost of workplace issues or conflicts, let me know. Otherwise, we look forward to having you back the 17th of June, and anything in the meantime, drop us a line. So that's it from us today. So thanks very much, and take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.